For 1,000 years, a whole civilization was silent. Its stories were locked in stone, completely unreadable. Then one discovery changed it all. The stone started a race. A fierce intellectual race to bring ancient Egypt back. It was a decades-long struggle. Nations and brilliant minds all pitted against each other over a simple slab of black granite. It became the most important puzzle in history. What does it take to crack a code like that? A code that defeated generations. And what happens when those voices finally speak again? It was July of 1799. A French officer, Pierre, was overseeing his men. They were rebuilding a wall at a fort near the Nile Delta. They were pulling apart old foundations, and something caught the light. A large, dark slab like granite, roughly the size of a tabletop. Its surface was covered in writing. 3 distinct bands of text carved right into the stone. Was an engineer, he saw order. He halted the work. He had the stone cleaned. He brought it to the scholars traveling with Napoleon's expedition. That was the discovery. The stone was a decree, issued by priests in 196 before the Common Era. It praised the young pharaoh, Ptolemy V, for his generosity to the temples. On its own, it was bureaucratic flattery, important but not earth-shattering. The genius was in the presentation. The same decree carved 3 times in 3 different scripts. The bottom was ancient Greek, a language European scholars knew. The middle was Demotic, the everyday cursive script of Egyptian business. And the top, the crown, was in formal hieroglyphs, the sacred picture writing of the pharaohs, a complete mystery for over 1,000 years. Think about that. It was like having a speech printed side by side, in English, in shorthand, and in a beautiful, forgotten code. If you could read the English, you had a direct parallel to the other two. The stone wasn't just a message, it was a translation manual, a key dug out of a wall. The French scholars knew it. They called it the stone, and they understood its potential. This was the first real hope, that the silence of ancient Egypt could be broken. The voices of the pharaohs, the stories of the gods, a 3,000-year civilization. It might all be waiting just on the other side of this linguistic wall. The race was on. But having a key is one thing. Understanding how to turn it in a lock you cannot see is another. The stone presented a solution wrapped in an enigma, but that key was almost impossible to use. For over 1,000 years, everyone had been reading it wrong. The greatest minds in Europe looked at those carvings, the birds, the snakes, the eyes, and they came to a single elegant conclusion. And it was completely wrong. They believed hieroglyphs were pure symbols. Each picture was a direct idea. A spiritual concept, a piece of magic. An owl meant wisdom, a lion meant strength, a circle was the sun. This wasn't a way to write down words or sounds, it was a mystical code, a secret language just for priests and for gods, and this idea was ancient. Greek and Roman writers had said the same thing. It was a beautiful theory. It made the script feel profound, otherworldly, and it also made it impossible to decipher. How do you translate a symbol for eternity or divine power? You guess, and for centuries, that's what scholars did. The most famous was a Jesuit scholar in the 17th century, a brilliant man, fluent in many languages, obsessed with Egypt. He studied Coptic, the final stage of the Egyptian language, and he produced volume after volume of what he said were translations of hieroglyphic texts. They were works of imagination. A single symbol, he might say, contained an entire philosophical treatise. Carving of a hawk could be decoded into a paragraph about the soul's journey. His work was respected, influential, and from where we stand, completely fictional. He was solving a puzzle that didn't exist because he was holding the key upside down. That was the wall the first faced. It wasn't just a lack of data, it was a wall of belief, centuries old and prestigious. And then the stone, right there in its Greek text, offered a quiet clue. It said the decree was to be inscribed in 3 ways. Sacred characters, native characters, and Greek characters. Sacred characters meant hieroglyphs. Native characters was Demotic, the everyday script. The stone itself was telling them that hieroglyphs and Demotic were 2 versions of the same thing, 2 ways to write the Egyptian language, one for temples, one for markets. But could a scholarly community, steeped in that symbolic myth, even hear that message? To crack the code, someone first had to challenge a core assumption. They had to stop seeing beautiful, mysterious art and start seeing an alphabet. The stone wasn't in French hands anymore. Napoleon's campaign fell apart, and by 1802 under a treaty the stone was sent to London. It ended up in the British Museum where it still is. But the text itself was like a ghost. It haunted the studies and salons across Europe. The museum made plaster casts, printed copies of the inscriptions. They sent them out to any scholar who might try. It was an open challenge, a puzzle thrown to the greatest minds, and the first serious contenders came forward. In Paris, the Orientalist looked at the copies. He focused on the middle band, the Demotic script. He was a master of languages and he had a method. He looked for the one thing that would be the same in all three texts, the names. In the Greek section, he found the royal names, Ptolemy and Cleopatra. Then he searched the Demotic for clusters of symbols in the same relative positions. It was a brilliant start. He identified the outlines of those royal cartouches, the oval loops around the names, but he couldn't go further. He passed his notes to a former student, a Swedish diplomat named David, took the work and ran with it. Using this method, he managed to isolate not just the shapes of the names, but some of the letters inside them. He correctly identified over a dozen Demotic signs that seemed to represent sounds, like P and T and L. For a moment, it looked like a breakthrough. He published a pamphlet saying he had deciphered the Demotic text, but then he stopped. He hit an invisible wall, and the reason was both men were still prisoners of the old idea. They saw Demotic as a separate, alphabetic script for the common people. And they saw the hieroglyphs at the top as something entirely different, a symbolic sacred code with no connection to speech. They had found a few phonetic pieces in the Demotic puzzle, but they believed the hieroglyphic puzzle was made of completely different material. They were trying to solve two different puzzles with one key, and it wouldn't turn. Their work was a collection of brilliant fragments, glimpses of sound in the wrong place. The frustration across Europe grew. The stone had given them a translation, but not the grammar of the language itself. It showed the destination, but not the path. The race demanded more than diligent scholarship. It demanded someone who could forget everything they thought they knew and see the writing on the stone with entirely new eyes. Two men stepped into this deadlock. They were very different men, separated by the channel, separated by temperament, but they were both looking at the same stone. Their rivalry would turn a puzzle into a matter of national pride. Britain had the trophy, the actual stone in its museum. France had the legacy, all the notes and drawings and expertise from Napoleon's scholars in Egypt. It was a cold war of the mind, and the two generals who led it were opposites. On the British side was Thomas Young, a true polymath, a physician, a physicist who worked on light, a master of languages. He treated the stone like a complex equation. He was systematic, brilliant, detached. He saw patterns. Using the Greek text as his anchor, he compared the frequency of words and symbols across the three scripts. He made a crucial leap. He proved the Demotic script wasn't a separate alphabet, but a descendant of the hieroglyphs. More than that, he proposed the hieroglyphs inside the royal cartouches. Those oval loops around names like Ptolemy and Cleopatra were used phonetically to spell out sounds. He correctly identified several of these sound signs. Thomas Young had found the first real crack. He published his findings, but with caution. He called them conjectures. For him, it was a problem in pattern recognition. In France, a young man read Young's work with a different kind of fire. Jean was not detached. He was a linguist possessed. As a child, he said he would decipher the hieroglyphs. He dedicated his life to it. While Young studied the stone, studied the language he believed was behind it, Coptic, the final form of ancient Egyptian used by Christians there. He became so fluent he thought in Coptic. He was sure it was the direct key. Where Young saw a puzzle, saw a lost civilization waiting to be resurrected. He saw Young's discoveries not as collaboration, but as a challenge from a rival nation. This was no longer just scholarship. It was a duel. Every paper from London was a gauntlet thrown. Every note from Paris was a parry and a thrust. The competition became fierce, often bitter. Would build on Young's phonetic idea, then dismiss the Englishman's broader work. Young grew frustrated with the Frenchman's passionate, all-or-nothing claims. Yet that tension, that clash of minds and egos became the engine. Each man's published work forced the other to dig deeper, to test harder. They were running a relay race against time, but neither would pass the baton. The final sprint was about to begin. It would require a leap of faith only one of them was desperate enough to make. Thomas Young solved problems by seeing patterns in the noise. He was a physicist. He'd studied how light waves interfered, making those bands of color. He brought that eye to the stone. He didn't just read it, he measured it. He counted how often certain Greek words showed up. Then he looked at the Demotic and the hieroglyphs for groups of symbols that appeared just as often. It was with statistics. And he focused on those oval loops, the cartouches. People thought they held royal names, setting them apart. Young took that idea and tested it. He used the Greek text like a key. He found the name Ptolemy there. Then in the hieroglyphs he found a cartouche. It had a sequence, a half circle, a lion, a rope, another half circle, more signs. If this was Ptolemy, then each sign might not be a symbol for a king. It might be a letter, a sound. He thought the half circle was a P, the lion, an L, the rope, a T. He was building a phonetic alphabet from the stone up. He did it again with another name, Berenice, from a different inscription. His chart grew. He had sounds for maybe a dozen hieroglyphs. That was the crack in the dam. For the first time in over 1,000 years, someone had read an ancient Egyptian word from the script. The silence was breaking. But Young, for all his brilliance, couldn't break the final rule. He thought his discovery was the exception. He believed hieroglyphs were still a symbolic, sacred code. The phonetic idea, he figured, was just a tool, something the Egyptians used to spell out foreign names like the Greek Ptolemies, a shortcut for outsiders. The real language of the pharaohs, he was sure, was still in pure pictures. He published his findings with careful, modest titles. He called them conjectures. He built a magnificent bridge, but he stood in the middle of it, convinced it only led to a small island. He couldn't see the continent on the other side, waiting for someone with a different vision to take that last step across. Didn't just study languages, he lived inside them. Thomas Young saw the stone as a puzzle box, saw it as a tomb door. He was desperate to hear the voices on the other side. That obsession started when he was a child, with stories from Napoleon's expedition. By 16, he'd already said it. He said his life's mission was to be the one who deciphered the hieroglyphs. This wasn't a scholarly interest, it was a compulsion. His was a deep dive into a language everyone else thought was a dead end, Coptic, the language of Egyptian Christians used in their liturgy for centuries after the pharaohs were gone. Other scholars knew about it, but did something radical. He didn't just learn Coptic, he made it his second voice. He wrote his private diary in it. He practiced speaking it aloud to himself, trying to hear the echoes of an older world. He believed with a fanatic's conviction that Coptic wasn't a separate language. It was the final living breath of ancient Egyptian. The grammar, the core vocabulary, the sound of it. He was sure this was the sonic key. That gave him a profound advantage over the methodical Young. Young was matching shapes on a page, was preparing to understand a living conversation. So when he looked at the stone's Demotic script, he didn't just see squiggles. He saw a rapid, cursive form of the hieroglyphs. And when he looked at the hieroglyphs, he wasn't looking for abstract symbols. He was listening for the ghost of Coptic words in their arrangement. His preparation meant he wasn't just trying to read a single decree. He was building the mental framework to read anything they might have written. He was assembling the dictionary and the grammar book from the inside out, long before he knew the alphabet. That obsessive groundwork meant that when his moment of revelation came, he wouldn't just decode a name. He would unlock the mechanism of an entire civilization's speech. The final push would need a brilliant, intuitive leap, and only a mind saturated in the language's rhythm would be ready to make it. Was working with copies of inscriptions from Egypt, drawings from the temple. And there was this large, clear cartouche, an oval framing a sequence of hieroglyphs. He started applying Thomas Young's phonetic principle, sounded out the signs based on the alphabet he'd built from the name Ptolemy. The first sign was a sun disk. In Coptic, the word for sun was Ra. The next sign was a shape he'd seen before. He thought it could make an M sound, then a folded cloth, maybe an S. He sounded it out. Ramesses, and this wasn't a Greek name, not Ptolemy. Not Cleopatra, this was something native. His knowledge of Coptic fused with the sounds. Ra was the sun god, could come from the Coptic verb to give birth. Ramesses, Ra has given birth to him, the legendary pharaoh. The pieces didn't just fit, they exploded. This wasn't a foreign name forced into phonetic spelling. This was an ancient Egyptian king, his name written in his own language using the same phonetic principle. The rule Young thought was the exception was the foundation. The entire system snapped into focus. Realized hieroglyphs weren't one thing, they were a flexible script. Some signs were phonetic, representing consonant sounds like the letters in. Others were ideograms, representing whole ideas or objects. The sun disk could also mean day, or the sun god directly, and often they worked together. A phonetic spelling followed by a silent picture, a determinative that told you the category of the word. Whether it was a name of a person, a city, a verb, it was a complex living writing system. How a civilization wrote everything, tax records, love poetry, hymns for the gods. The code wasn't just cracked. The entire logic of the language was laid bare. For the first time in over a millennium, a true name from deep in Egypt's past was spoken aloud, not guessed at, read. And with that single word, a door swung open. A world of voices waiting to be heard. Suddenly the whole thing clicked. It wasn't a fixed code, it was a flexible system. Saw hieroglyphs working in three ways, sometimes all in one word. First, the phonetic sign. They acted like an alphabet, but just for consonants. A bird could be the sound A, a hand could be D, they spelled out the skeleton of the word. Then ideograms, the classic picture symbols. A drawing of a sun disk meant the word sun. An owl meant owl, direct, visual. But the real key was the third part, the determinatives. These were silent signs, little pictures at the end of a word. They didn't add sound, they added context. They told you what kind of word you were reading. After phonetic signs for a verb like to run, the scribe would add a determinative of walking legs, a visual cue, a category marker. A city name might end with a crossroads sign, a god's name with a seated deity. This three-part system, phonetics for sound, ideograms for meaning, determinatives for context, was efficient. It created clarity. It prevented confusion in a language with no written vowels. It wasn't the mystical one-symbol, one-idea fantasy that had blocked understanding for centuries. This was practical, sophisticated. It could record a tax receipt or a hymn to the gods. With this rulebook wasn't just reading names anymore. He could parse sentences. He could see where a verb began and ended, distinguish a place from a person. The temple walls weren't silent murals now. They were paragraphs, chapters. The grammar of a civilization was laid bare. Its stories were waiting. The announcement came in 1822. Sent his letter to the French Academy. He laid out his system. He said the ancient Egyptian language could be read, but the silence that followed wasn't applause, it was skepticism. The race wasn't over. Now came the struggle for acceptance. People who believed the old symbolic theories, they felt their careers were under attack. In England, Thomas Young, he had the phonetic idea first. He felt his work was being erased. He argued system was too rigid, that it couldn't explain everything. Other scholars, they just refused to believe it, that these beautiful sacred pictures could be something as mundane as an alphabet for sounds. They called it a fantasy, a lucky guess. The controversy became a second battlefield. Wasn't just a scholar now. He was a lawyer defending his life's work. In a hostile court of European academia, his response wasn't just more arguments, it was an avalanche of proof. He spent the next years doing two things. First, he built the infrastructure. He published a detailed grammar, he compiled a dictionary, he gave the world the tools to test his system for themselves. Second, he went to the source. He led a scientific expedition to Egypt, the first real field trip with the new key in hand. Imagine that. Standing before the colossal temples at Thebes, at Karnak, inscriptions covering every surface. For centuries they were just carvings, now could read them. He could point to a column of glyphs and translate it on the spot, verifying names, titles, historical events against the known records from Greek historians. Each correct translation was a brick in a wall of evidence. Slowly, the critics fell silent. One by one, as other scholars used his grammar and found it worked on new inscriptions, the resistance crumbled. The final victory wasn't the moment of decipherment in a Paris study. It was the moment the entire scholarly world had to agree. The race had two finishes. The first was a brilliant, solitary sprint to an answer. The second was a long, public marathon to prove that answer was true. And sometimes, convincing the world is the harder part. The stone walls started to whisper. And it wasn't about kings anymore. It was about the gods. For the first time in over 1,000 years, you could say their names out loud. You could read them right from the stone. That cartouche principle, the one that worked for pharaohs, it was the key to everything. A falcon-headed figure wasn't just an image. The glyphs next to it spelled the name Horus, a throne-shaped sign, then the sounds. No doubt, the mother goddess with the throne on her head, she wasn't a symbol, she was Isis. The name was right there. The jackal guarding the tombs was Anubis. The sun disk with rays was Ra. These weren't guesses from Greek stories anymore. These were direct introductions, in the language of the people who them. It was a revolution. Scholars could translate the hymns carved around the images. They were prayers full of praise. They could read the ritual texts from the temples written on papyrus. And suddenly the relationships between the gods snapped into focus. The story of Osiris, murdered by his brother Set, brought back by Isis, avenged by Horus, that wasn't just a myth from outsiders. It was written in the sacred script, a cosmic struggle between order and chaos. You could trace the rise of the state god Amun, merging with Ra to become Amun-Ra, king of the gods. The pantheon wasn't a static list of animal-headed statues anymore. It was a family, a dynamic, interconnected family with its own dramas, its own domains, woven into the fabric of Egyptian life. But it went deeper than stories. Translating these texts revealed the philosophy underneath. A single concept kept appearing, T, represented by a feather. T was cosmic order, balance, justice. It was the pharaoh's duty to uphold T on earth. It was every person's hope to be judged by it after death. The weighing of the heart scene in the Book of the Dead, you could understand it now. It wasn't just a scary judgment, it was an affirmation. A moral universe, where your life was measured against a divine standard of harmony. That gave you insight into the Egyptian mind. Their religion wasn't about fearing capricious gods. It was about participating in a balance. Every correct ritual, every just action was a thread holding creation together. The silent statues in the tombs now had identities. They had stories, they had purpose. A depiction of Hathor wasn't just a cow-headed figure. She was the mistress of music, dance, motherhood. The inscriptions nearby might be a song to welcome her. This transformed everything. It moved Egyptology from speculation about a lost culture to a detailed study of a living belief system. You could understand how they explained the sunrise, the Nile flood, how they coped with loss, what they hoped for in the afterlife. It showed how religion was the engine of their civilization. It motivated art. It governed law. It gave meaning to a history that lasted 3,000 years. The gods were finally speaking, and they had a lot to say about how to build a world that lasts, but the clearest voices were the rulers themselves. Once we could read the hieroglyphs, the pharaohs weren't silent anymore. They introduced themselves. Every king had a formal 5 great names, and these weren't just titles. This was propaganda carved in stone, and now we could read the slogans. The Horus name showed the king as the living falcon god. The golden Horus name spoke of his divine, unchanging nature. The two ladies' name tied him to the protective goddesses of Upper and Lower Egypt. His throne name declared his rule as the embodiment of T, that cosmic order. And the Nomen, his birth name, connected him to a royal line. Reading these 5 names together was like reading a political resume. You saw how a pharaoh like the second wanted to be seen. As a mighty warrior, a divine champion, the unifier of the 2 lands. The stone gave us the grammar to parse their most basic statements of power. This turned legend into ledger. The annals of great military campaigns, once just vague stories from Greek historians, became detailed reports. Take the third, often called the Napoleon of ancient Egypt. On the temple walls at Karnak, his scribes recorded his Syrian campaigns year by year. They listed the cities he took, the tribute he received, even the types of trees he brought back. This wasn't myth, it was a strategic record. And the famous battle of, where the second fought the Hittites, is shown in sprawling reliefs. The hieroglyphs don't just show the chaos of chariots. They give the king's speech to his troops, his plea to the god Amun, his own version of a glorious victory. These were state documents, written to impress, but they anchored these rulers in real time and real geography. Beyond the battlefields, building inscriptions gave the chronology of an empire. When a pharaoh founded a temple or a city, he would carve the event into its foundation. These texts gave the year of his reign, the reason for the build, to honor a god, to mark a jubilee. By cross-referencing these dates across different sites, historians could start to build a skeleton. A timeline where a name was no longer just a name, but a reign with a beginning, a middle, and an end. The history of Egypt began to shift from a shadowy sequence of dynasties into a story of individuals. And sometimes the individuals became startlingly personal. The heretic pharaoh Akhenaten, who abandoned the old gods for the sun disk Aten, didn't just leave temples, he left poetry. Hymns to the Aten, written in a flowing, almost emotional style, describing the sun's rays as hands that caress the world. This was the voice of a religious revolutionary, a new and intimate vision of the divine. Then there were the letters, a cache of clay tablets found at Akhenaten's capital. Written in cuneiform, they were diplomatic mail between the Egyptian court and other kings. But the Egyptian replies, once translated, showed the pharaoh as a player in international politics, bargaining for gold, negotiating marriages, dealing with petty squabbles between vassal kings. It was high-stakes statecraft, with all the ego and frustration that came with it. The stone's key did more than unlock a language. It unlocked 3,000 years of dynastic conversation. We moved from seeing pharaohs as monolithic figures to understanding them as complex leaders. Some were brilliant administrators, some were relentless conquerors, some were failed reformers. Their achievements and their miscalculations were now documented in their own words. The history of ancient Egypt was no longer a silent film. It had a script, a cast of characters, and a plot full of ambition, devotion, and the relentless pursuit of legacy. The voices of the pharaohs were a start. But the real shift came when you could hear past the tomb walls, when you could hear the marketplace. That same key that opened the temples also opened the archives. And in there, written on things like broken pottery, cheap shards, fragile papyrus, you found the sound of everyday life. For every royal decree, there were 1,000 small notes. Tax receipts on the side of a broken jar, a farmer complaining to an official about a stolen donkey, a will dividing up a family's things, a contract for delivering linen. These were bureaucracy, written in the simpler scripts, Demotic, hieratic. They weren't meant for eternity. They were meant to solve a problem by next Tuesday. And in their overwhelming normalcy, they brought a society back. You could trace the price of grain over 10 years. You could follow a land dispute from the first complaint to the final ruling. You could see an economy working, scribes as the accountants, the lawyers of the Nile. This was the paperwork of an empire. And it showed the civilization was held together not just by its gods, but by the mundane, meticulous work of its people. Then beyond the ledgers, there were the manuals, medical papyri. The Smith papyrus reads like a textbook. It moves past magic, past incantations. It describes clinical observations. It details 48 cases, injuries, head wounds to spinal fractures with a clear method. Examination, diagnosis, prognosis, treatment. The text tells a surgeon how to suture a wound, set a bone, how to recognize a spinal injury that can't be fixed. The tone is practical, systematic. It shows a society engaging with the body not just as a spirit's vessel, but as a physical system to be understood, to be repaired. This was advanced, rational science walking right beside ritual. And then the stories, literary works on papyrus rolls. They show the Egyptians loved a good tale. The tale of is a psychological drama. A courtier flees Egypt after the pharaoh dies, lives in exile in the Levant, becomes a tribal chief, but is haunted by homesickness. His longing for the Nile, for the language, for the rituals of home, it's moving. It's a story about identity, belonging, the price of exile. It has the depth of a novel. Then something like the Instructions of is a collection of wise sayings. Advice for a good, modest, ethical life. Be generous to the poor. Don't cheat in the market. Control your temper. It talks about a quiet heart as the greatest treasure. That's moral philosophy. A guide to personal integrity that echoes for. But maybe the most direct connection is the letters. Personal correspondence found bundled up, forgot. A soldier writing home to his mother, asking after the family, sending his love. A wife chiding her absent husband for not writing. A son assuring his parents he's well. They're filled with gossip, worries about health, requests for honey or cloth. They are utterly, beautifully ordinary. In these lines, the 3,000-year gap vanishes. You're not looking at a civilization, you're listening to a person. The fears, the affections, the daily concerns of a human being who just happened to live along the Nile 2,000 years before the Common Era. That was the final gift of the decipherment. It did more than restore kings and gods to history. It restored humanity. It proved ancient Egypt wasn't a land of silent statues and solemn tombs. It was a vibrant, noisy world of farmers and physicians, poets and parents, scribes and soldiers. A world where people fell in love, argued in court, told thrilling stories, sought wisdom, missed their families. The stone didn't just unlock a language. It opened a window into a living, breathing society and invited us to look inside. Egypt's ambition was measured in grain and gold. Those temples and cities, they were funded, they were supplied. The writing gave us the balance sheets. We have the inventories from royal granaries, vast warehouses holding the harvest, lists of cattle counted by the thousand, records from Nile vineyards, jars of wine for temple offerings or royal banquets. This was the agricultural heartbeat. A system of taxing, storing, redistributing food. It fed the armies. It paid the laborers who built the monuments. It was the economic engine. You see the administrative genius in the tomb biographies of high officials. These aren't just prayers, they're resumes. A man named an expedition leader had his adventures carved on his tomb wall. He describes leading caravans south into Nubia to bring back exotic goods. Another official, a treasurer, boasts of managing the king's mines, and these mining expeditions were massive, state-funded operations. Papyri detailed journeys into the harsh eastern desert, the Sinai Peninsula. They went for turquoise, a sacred stone, for copper for tools and weapons, and above all for gold. The Turin Papyrus is essentially a map, a guide to the gold-bearing regions of the eastern desert. It notes the routes, the water sources, the yields of different mines. This wasn't treasure hunting. It was industrial resource extraction, planned and logged by a central authority. That authority managed trade on a staggering scale. We can read the manifests for ships that sailed the open sea. Expeditions to the fabled land of Punt on the Red Sea coast, likely modern Eritrea or Somalia. They went for myrrh and frankincense, resins that burned as temple incense, the sacred scent of the gods. The reliefs at El show these ships returning, heavy with live myrrh trees, ivory, ebony, exotic animals. A dangerous, year-long voyage for a commodity essential to ritual life. In the other direction, trade with Lebanon brought back cedar wood. The tall, straight trunks were unmatched for building the great ships of the Pharaoh, for the massive doors and ceilings of temples. Egypt had no forests. Its wood was imported, through negotiated trade, through military pressure, logged in diplomatic letters we can now read. What emerges from these ledgers and manifests is a portrait of a bureaucratic machine. A state that could count every jar of grain, track every ounce of gold from vein to treasury, coordinate sea voyages to distant lands. This administrative muscle made the impossible possible. It marshaled resources to feed a workforce of thousands for decades to build a pyramid. It equipped armies that campaigned deep into the Levant. It created the material surplus that allowed art and architecture to flourish. The spiritual world of the gods, the glory of the pharaohs, it all rested on this foundation of meticulous, mundane accounting. The language gave us the keys to the temple, but also to the warehouse, the mine, the docks. And that may be the most profound thing, that eternity was built one receipt at a time. They mastered the world, and that meant mastering numbers. You see it in the pyramids, the temples, that precision. But for a long time, it was just a silent skill. We could see what they built, but we didn't know how they thought. Decipherment changed that. We got their textbooks, not for the gods, these were for the scribes. The mathematical papyrus is the famous one, a long scroll hieratic script. It's a training manual, 84 problems with the solutions worked out. It shows you their arithmetic. It was all about doubling, halving. They were comfortable with fractions, but mostly unit fractions, a half, a third, a fourth. They solved problems we'd call algebra. A quantity and its seventh added together become 19. What is the quantity? The papyrus walks through it. It's methodical, finding unknown values for dividing bread, for figuring a pyramid's slope. Their geometry was practical. They had the right formula for the volume of a granary. They could approximate the area of a circle, which gave them a very close value for pi. This wasn't abstract. This was the toolkit for running a civilization, surveying fields after the Nile flood, calculating bricks for a ramp, allocating rations. The precision of their monuments, it wasn't magic. It was a society that had standardized these methods, taught them in schools, applied them on a huge scale. Their gaze went from the earth to the sky. Astronomy was in their calendar, their religion, their survival. Decipherment let us read their star charts. They'd named the constellations. They tracked planets, which they called the ones who know no rest. Their calendar was solar, 365 days split into 3 seasons tied to the Nile, inundation, growth, harvest. But the key event was the heliacal rising of Sirius. That's when Sirius first appears, just before dawn, after being gone. They saw that this event coincided with the start of the Nile flood. In their texts, the connection is clear. The goddess was Sirius, the herald of the inundation. Her return brought the water. Their whole agricultural year, their ritual year, was set to this cosmic clock. This was observation over generations, leading to a predictive model of their world, science in service of society. You see the same blend in their medical texts. The papyrus, the Smith papyrus, they're not just their diagnostic manuals. A physician would examine a patient, follow a structure. The text gives a title, an examination, a diagnosis, a verdict on whether it was treatable, then the treatment. Treatments mix the rational and the ritual. A wound might be stitched, a poultice of honey applied, and an incantation spoken. To us, that seems like a contradiction. But to them, illness could have a physical cause and a spiritual dimension. A broken bone was a mechanical thing to set. A fever might be an invading spirit to drive out with words. Decipherment lets us see the system whole. We can appreciate their anatomy knowledge, their herbal catalog, their surgical tools, without dismissing the incantations as superstition. They were using every tool they had to restore balance, to fight disorder. It was a holistic approach. What you get from reading these scientific texts is a portrait of a systematic culture. They observed the natural world with care. They developed repeatable methods for engineering, timekeeping, health. Their framework was different from ours. It blended the measurable with the metaphysical, but it was a framework. It was consistent. It let them predict the flood, build for eternity, try to heal the body. The stone gave us more than poetry. It gave us their calculators, their star maps, their medical charts. It showed a civilization that sought not just to live in the world, but to measure it, to map its rhythms, to comprehend its logic on their own terms. Justice was part of the Nile, part of the land itself. That principle, cosmic order, truth, it was the law. And we know that because of the language, because of the records. We don't have a stone pillar of laws, we have the paperwork. Thousands of documents on papyrus, on broken pottery. They show the system working from the vizier's court all the way down to a village dispute. There's a place, El Medina, a village for the tomb builders. Their community archives are full of legal cases. One record is about a man. He was accused of stealing a bronze chisel from the tomb works. The testimony is there. Witnesses are named. He was found guilty. He had to return the tool and pay a fine. Another case, a woman brought a complaint. She said her neighbor slandered her, damaged her reputation. The local council heard both sides. They made a judgment. This wasn't tyranny from above. This was community justice, trying to restore balance, to make things right according to T. The foundation was the contract. Marriage contracts were very detailed. They weren't about love. They were about economic partnership, social stability. A contract listed the property the wife brought in. That property stayed hers. It the husband's duty to support her. And it outlined grounds for divorce, the settlement that would follow. It protected the woman's rights to her possessions, often a share of the couple's wealth. This was a legal framework. It gave women a real degree of economic agency for the ancient world. If a dispute went beyond the village, you could appeal higher. Petitions survive, written to the vizier, the pharaoh's chief minister, the supreme judge. A farmer writes that a corrupt official took his goats. A widow petitions for her rightful inheritance. The language is formal, respectful, but direct. They invoke the pharaoh's duty to uphold T. They call on the state to live up to its own ideals. The system recognized in theory that even the lowest person had a right to seek redress. Every legal proceeding had an oath. Before testimony, you swore by the life of the pharaoh or in the name of a god, Amun-Ta. To break that oath wasn't just perjury. It was a religious offense, an invitation for divine wrath. This fused the legal and the spiritual. Truth-telling was a sacred duty. A court record might just note, he swore an oath by the ruler and he told the truth. The threat of cosmic disorder gave earthly testimony its weight. What you get from all these fragments is a society invested in order, not the silent order of statues. A living, breathing, argumentative order, a place where people sued over donkeys, where wives protected their assets, where workers expected a fair hearing. T was the guiding star, but the path was paved with papyrus petitions, witness contracts, solemn oaths. The law was how a civilization of millions, living along a narrow green ribbon in the desert, managed to coexist, to resolve conflicts. To believe that fairness wasn't just a heavenly concept, it was something you could demand in a dusty courtroom. That whole intellectual tradition was written on something incredibly fragile, papyrus. It's a plant pressed and woven into sheets. That was their paper. And paper over 2,000 years doesn't last, not in damp conditions, not out in the open. The real tragedy of lost Egyptian knowledge isn't about monuments being buried. It's about libraries turning to dust. Every book, every letter, every poem or recipe or contract just crumbling away. That's the silent backdrop to every papyrus we find. The stone gave us the ability to read, but it also showed us the staggering scale of what we'll never know. For every text we translate, thousands more vanished completely. It makes what survived feel like a miracle. And that survival happened in the most unlikely places. Tombs sometimes, where dry, sealed chambers could preserve scrolls left with the dead. but more often in trash heaps. Ancient towns had their dumps on the desert's edge. The arid, rainless climate of Egypt acted as a perfect preservative. A discarded tax record, a child's writing exercise, a worn-out love poem thrown away, buried under sand and time, they just waited. These weren't curated archives. They were accidental libraries assembled by neglect. And from these refuse piles, we've recovered voices with a breathtaking range. There's the sublime. The Chester papyri found in a jar near Thebes contain these exquisite love poems from the New Kingdom. They're not formal hymns. They're intimate, full of longing and playful imagery. One poem compares a lover's absence to a sickness. It says, 7 days since I saw my sister and illness has invaded me. That's a human voice speaking across 30 centuries about a feeling we all know. Then there's the fantastic. The papyrus, now in Berlin, is a collection of tales told at a pharaoh's court. In one, a magician parts a lake's waters to retrieve a lost pendant. In another, wax crocodiles come to life. This is ancient Egyptian fiction, a window into their imagination, their sense of wonder. And alongside these always is the mundane, lists of temple linen, a work roster for a gang of laborers, a letter from a son asking for a better pair of sandals. This juxtaposition is the point. It shows a civilization that was profoundly, ubiquitously literate. Writing wasn't just for kings and priests. It was for merchants, for soldiers, for farmers dealing with the state. The scribe was a central figure trained for years in a rigorous system. Temples almost certainly housed extensive archives, theological texts, astronomical charts, administrative records. We know they existed because we find references to them. But the buildings themselves, made of wood, are gone. The papyri inside are gone. Every fragment we translate, then, is a recovered volume from a library that's forever scattered. Each one is a piece of a mosaic where most of the tiles are missing. The stone did more than unlock a language. It made us aware of the library itself. It let us read the few surviving pages, and in doing that, comprehend the heartbreaking size of the empty shelves. It reminds us that history isn't just what was built in stone, but what was written in whispers on a stalk of reed. And how lucky we are to catch any echo at all. The stones started to speak. Before we could read them, a temple was just a beautiful ruin, carved walls, silent pillars, but after decipherment it became a narrator. Every surface was covered in a continuous text. From the big pylon gates all the way to the innermost sanctuary. These weren't random decorations. They were the building's own voice, saying why it was there, who built it, what happened inside. The first clue was often under the very first stone. Foundation deposits, ceremonial caches buried at the corners during the founding ritual. Archaeologists would find small plaques, tools, model bricks, offerings, and inscribed on them were the words of the ceremony itself. They recorded the exact moment. The pharaoh stretching the measuring cord, reciting the spells to sanctify the ground, laying the first brick, a frozen moment of ritual, the building's sacred birth certificate. You could read the intention right from the start. Then on the towering gateways, the dedication inscriptions, massive formal texts naming the pharaoh who ordered the work. They proclaimed his devotion to the gods the temple was offered to, a phrase like, His Majesty, King of Upper and Lower Egypt, beloved of Horus, he made this as his monument for his father, the god Amun. That was standard. But it was more than a signature. It linked the earthly ruler to the divine recipient, framing the whole structure as an act of piety. A transaction of devotion meant to ensure cosmic and political order. Most powerfully, the wall reliefs came alive with captions. A procession of priests carrying a sacred boat wasn't just a scene. The hieroglyphs above their heads explained the festival, the date, the ritual being performed. A depiction of the pharaoh smiting enemies wasn't just propaganda art. The text might name the foreign chiefs, list the captured towns, describe the victory as a gift to the god. At the temple dedicated to the falcon god Horus, the walls do something extraordinary. They tell the temple's own story in epic detail. Inscriptions describe the mythical foundation of the site, the primordial battle between Horus and his enemy Set. Then they chronicle the actual historical construction process, which took over 200 years. They name the architects. They list the types of wood imported for the doors. They even record a dispute over land with a neighboring temple. It's a complete biography in stone. This transformed archaeology. Scholars could move far beyond measuring columns and mapping rooms. They could comprehend the ideological blueprint. The inscriptions revealed the symbolic journey it was meant to take. The outer courts with texts about public festivals and royal power. The inner halls with more secretive rituals for higher priests only. The Holy of Holies, the darkest room where the god's statue resided, its text spoke of daily offerings, of awakening and clothing the deity. You could understand the function of every niche, every corridor. A room wasn't just a room. It was the hall of the Ennead, where the 9 great gods were invoked, and the inscriptions on its walls were the very hymns sung to them. The silence of the ruins was gone, replaced by a low, constant hum of meaning, a whisper from every carved surface explaining the purpose of its own existence. The stone's echoes traveled far beyond the Nile. They reached into the foundations of Western history. Deciphering hieroglyphs did something monumental for biblical and classical studies. It gave an anchor, a fixed point in a sea of ancient stories. For the first time, scholars could check the Hebrew Bible, the histories of Greece, against the records of a neighboring superpower. Egypt was no longer a silent backdrop. It became a witness, a participant. Its own archives could confirm things, challenge things, expand the world we thought we knew. One sharp validation came from a granite slab. The stele, dated to around 1208 BCE, it celebrates Pharaohs' military victories, and among the conquered peoples listed there's a line: Israel is laid waste, its seed is no more. That's the earliest known mention of Israel outside the Bible. It's not scripture. It's a boast from an Egyptian king, carved in stone at the height of his power. For historians, this was electrifying. It placed a group called Israel in Canaan in the late 13th century. It didn't prove the Exodus or the biblical conquests, but it proved the people the Bible talks about were there, on the historical stage, interacting with empires. The silence was breaking, and it was naming names we recognized. Egypt's records became a master ledger. Their annals detailed centuries of diplomacy, conflict with other powers. We could read Egyptian accounts of treaties with the Hittites, wars with the Assyrian, skirmishes with Libyan tribes. These weren't just Egyptian history. They were the same events that shaped the world of the ancient Israelites, the geopolitical context of the biblical stories. When the Bible mentions a pharaoh, we could often identify which one, trace his policies, understand his reign. The vague king of Egypt gained a face, a timeline, a set of recorded actions. This gave an external framework, a way to see the biblical narrative not in isolation, but as one thread in a vast tapestry. Perhaps the most dramatic context came from Egyptian descriptions of a catastrophic wave of invaders, the Sea Peoples. Inscriptions from an III describe coordinated attacks from the sea. The foreign countries made a conspiracy in their islands, one text reads. All at once the lands were removed and scattered in the fray. These records, now readable, shed light on the late Bronze Age collapse. Around 1200 BCE, when civilizations from Greece to Anatolia to the Levant suddenly fell, the Egyptian accounts gave a name to one likely catalyst. They showed a world in chaotic transition, a plausible historical setting for upheavals hinted at in Greek legends and biblical memories. Finally, understanding Egypt provided a check on the classical authors. Herodotus, the Greek historian, wrote about Egypt in the 5th century BCE. For centuries, his accounts were taken as authoritative. Now scholars could read what Egyptians wrote about their own history, religion, customs. They found Herodotus got some things right, and a great deal wrong, mixing fact with folklore, misunderstanding rituals, repeating travelers' tales. The Egyptian texts let historians separate the Greek observer's perspective from Egyptian reality. Egypt was no longer filtered through Herodotus's imagination. It could speak for itself, correct the record, demand to be understood on its own terms. So the stone's gift wasn't confined to one civilization. By giving voice to ancient Egypt, it created a conversation across the ancient world. The Bible's stories, Greece's histories, fragments of lost empires, all could be held up against the detailed testimony of the Nile. What emerged wasn't a single truth. It was a richer, more complex picture of how these cultures clashed, traded, feared, influenced one another. The land of mystery had become history's most reliable witness. A voice isn't a science. For centuries, that fascination with Egypt was just a cabinet of curiosities. Travelers would bring back mummies for parties. Scholars had these mystical theories. It was treasure hunting and speculation. Its breakthrough changed the currency. It replaced guesswork with grammar. Being able to read the language turned admiration into analysis. It gave the world its first real tool for interrogation. Not just what a statue looked like, but what an inscription said. Wrote it and why? That shift from an antiquarian hobby to a disciplined inquiry, that was the moment Egyptology was born, and philology became the cornerstone, the rigorous study of language in historical texts. It's more than translation. It's about context, grammar, evolution. How a word was used in a legal contract versus a love poem, tracing how the script changed from the Old Kingdom to the Ptolemaic era. Grammar and dictionary were the first philological tools for Egypt. They provided a replicable method, so a scholar in Berlin could apply the same rules to a new inscription as a scholar in Paris. That created a shared foundation, a common language for the new science, and almost immediately, institutions formed around this new certainty. The first academic chairs dedicated specifically to Egyptology were established at European universities. These weren't positions for general antiquarians, they were for philologists, experts trained in the grammar and scripts. Their job was to teach the next generation the rigorous methodology, to build upon that foundation systematically. This academic legitimacy attracted funding, it organized research, it set professional standards, and at the same time archaeology transformed. Before, digging was often a hunt for beautiful objects for private collections. Now expeditions had a powerful new compass, the written word. An archaeologist could uncover a broken statue, and if it had text, immediately learn its subject, its patron, its date. This made excavation a dialogue. The spade would ask the question. The philologist would provide the answer from the inscription. Systematic surveys began, like the Prussian expedition led by Richard in the 1840s. They didn't just collect, they recorded. Every inscription they found, publishing these vast, meticulous volumes that became essential references. And this new discipline needed a home for its discoveries. The chaotic collections of the past gave way to organized public institutions. The Egyptian Museum in Cairo was founded in the mid-19th century, becoming the central repository for a nation reclaiming its own past. In London, the British Museum's Egyptian collection, anchored by the stone itself, expanded into a systematic display of history, organized by dynasty and theme. These museums were no longer curiosity cabinets. They were libraries of stone and papyrus, arranged according to the new historical understanding that the decipherment made possible. So the race to decode did more than solve a 2,000-year-old mystery. It constructed an entire intellectual ecosystem. It created a self-sustaining field with trained specialists, academic journals, debates, long-term projects. One man's obsessive breakthrough became a collective enterprise. Generations of scholars could now dedicate their lives to exploring not just the pyramids but the poetry, not just the tombs but the tax records. Every facet of that civilization became a legitimate subject for scientific study. The silence was broken, and in its place arose a sustained, disciplined conversation. One that's still unfolding today. They worked with plaster casts by candlelight. Today's tools would seem like magic. The race never ended, it just changed its tools. We moved from the magnifying glass to the machine. Take multispectral imaging. A papyrus scroll, charred black in the eruption of Vesuvius, is completely unreadable. But under different wavelengths of light, the faded ink absorbs and reflects in unique ways. A computer processes those differences, and letters emerge from the ash. Entire texts, thought lost forever, recovered without ever touching the brittle surface. It's like giving the past a voice it didn't know it still had. Then there are secrets hidden in plain sight, or inside wrappings. For over a century, museums held mummies with small inscribed amulets placed over the heart or eyes. To read them, you'd have to unwrap the bundle, cause damage. Now a CT scanner peers through the layers of linen and resin. It maps the three-dimensional shape of a scarab, carved from stone, and digitally unrolls its inscribed base. We can read the spells meant to guide the individual in the afterlife without disturbing their rest. Technology grants a kind of respectful X-ray vision, letting these sacred objects fulfill their protective role for eternity while still sharing their knowledge. But perhaps the most profound shift is in sheer scale. Spend a lifetime building a mental dictionary. A modern researcher has a digital one. Vast online corpora contain millions of words from inscriptions, papyri, ostraca. A scholar can search for a rare word, a specific grammatical construction, across 3,000 years of texts in seconds. They can compare variations in a single story across a dozen copies. Analyze writing styles, track the evolution of a phrase, see patterns no single mind could ever hold. The database acts as a collective memory, a force multiplier for curiosity. And yet, for all this power, the work is far from finished. The core system of hieroglyphs is solved, but mastering Middle Egyptian, the classical language of the great monuments, is a lifelong pursuit of nuance. Its grammar holds subtleties we are still refining. Beyond that lie older frontiers. The Proto-Sinaitic script, carved into rocks in the Sinai Desert around 1800 BCE, one of the world's first alphabets. Scholars believe it was inspired by Egyptian hieroglyphs, adapted by Semitic workers. Cracking it fully would illuminate a pivotal moment in the history of writing itself. How one civilization's complex pictures sparked another, efficient letters. Every year, new excavations add more pages. A cache of administrative papyri found in a harbor, ceramic shards with prayers scrawled by pilgrims. Each new find is a fresh test for our understanding, a chance to confirm a hypothesis or overturn a lazy assumption. The Moderns Lab is part photography studio, part server room, part archaeological site. Each technological tool, the scanner, the database, the satellite image, acts as a new lens on the original stone breakthrough. It ensures Ski doesn't just open a door and then rust shut. It's constantly being refined, fitted to new locks we are still discovering. The conversation with the past is no longer a shout across a canyon. It's becoming a continuous, ever-clearer dialogue. Pushing the boundaries of what we thought was lost back, word by luminous word, that breakthrough reached far beyond museums. It changed the world people lived in. The 19th century brought an Egyptian revival across Europe and America. It was a visual fever. Before, Egyptian designs were just exotic curiosities. Now, with some of their meaning understood, they became a design language. Architects weren't just copying pyramids. They used these symbols of power and eternity, the ones that had just been deciphered. You see it in the Washington Monument, that tall obelisk, a form taken straight from pharaonic monuments built to catch the sun. You see it in cemetery gates shaped like pylon temples, with lotus blossoms and solar discs carved into them. Furniture, jewelry, theater sets, all filled with sphinxes and scarabs and ankhs. This wasn't random decoration. It was a culture, now able to speak, lending its ancient authority to modern ambitions. The silent stones started to dictate style, and the stone's name itself left history to become a metaphor. A stone now, it means any crucial key for translation. Software developers talk about finding the stone for old code. Geneticists look for a stone to translate between DNA and complex traits. It means that moment of clarity when a confusing system suddenly becomes readable. The original artifact gave its name to that human experience of a breakthrough. It taught us how to name our own moments of discovery. That idea of a universal key took physical form in the 20th century's most ambitious message. The Pioneer plaque, attached to a spacecraft sent toward interstellar space. How do you write a letter to an intelligence with no shared language, no shared context? The scientists, Carl Sagan among them, looked back to the stone. Their plaque used a three-part system. A diagram of hydrogen atoms to set a base unit of time and length, a map pointing back to Earth using pulsar stars, and silhouettes of a man and a woman. It was a modern attempt at a cosmic decree, using scientific instead of royal ones. The inspiration was clear. To be understood across an unimaginable gap, you give the same message in multiple converging codes. Maybe the most intimate legacy is in our pockets. Every day we use a writing system that mirrors the ancient Egyptian approach. We write phonetically with an alphabet, spelling out sounds to make words, and then we add silent that convey tone or emotion or quick concepts. A smiling face after a sentence, a heart, a thumbs up, a crying laugh. These are modern determinatives. They don't add sound. They add crucial context to plain text, to prevent misunderstanding, just like a hieroglyphic determinative told an ancient reader if a word was a city or an action. Our digital communication has unconsciously revived a 3,000-year-old solution to a timeless problem: how to pack nuance and feeling and clarity into written symbols. The decipherment did more than unlock a lost world. It showed us that the Egyptian way of thinking about language, flexible, layered, visual, wasn't obsolete. It was a prototype for how we would one day try to talk to the stars, and for how we would learn to talk to each other in a new global village. The past wasn't just speaking, it was helping to write the future. The stone's journey left a complicated legacy. It was taken as a spoil of war, a trophy from a conflict between empires. Today it's in the British Museum, seen by millions, and yet its home is a point of deep contention. Egypt has formally requested its return, calling it a symbol of national heritage. This isn't just about one slab of granite, it's about a fundamental question. Who truly owns the past? Is an artifact like this a piece of universal human history, best preserved where the world can see it? Or is it a vital piece of a specific cultural story, one that loses its meaning when separated from the land and the people it came from? The debate goes far beyond this one stone. Countless objects were removed from Egypt and other nations during eras of colonial exploration and military campaigns. Statues, ceremonial items, resting places. They fill institutions across Europe and America. For generations, these collections were presented as neutral acts of preservation, saving treasures from neglect. But the perspective has shifted. Now many argue that removal was itself a form of cultural loss, severing a direct connection between a people and their own history. So the race to decode the past leads to a modern conversation about ethical stewardship. Unlocking ancient voices was a monumental achievement, but it also forces us to confront how those voices were gathered. The methods of acquisition are now part of the story we have to tell. It raises questions about respect, about representation, about who gets to narrate a civilization's legacy. Is it the scholar in a distant library, or the descendant community for whom these names and gods are part of a living identity? There are no simple answers. Arguments for universal museums highlight the value of comparative study, bringing the world's cultures into dialogue under one roof. They point to the resources these institutions have for conservation. Arguments for repatriation emphasize cultural sovereignty, the right of a nation to reclaim its own patrimony, to use these objects to educate its own citizens first. This ongoing discussion is a testament to how much the stone changed us. It made ancient Egypt's culture so vivid, so real, that its physical remnants are no longer seen as mere curiosities. They're recognized as charged fragments of a national soul. The ethical dimension reminds us that the pursuit of knowledge is never separate from the context in which it occurs. Deciphering hieroglyphs was an intellectual triumph. Deciding where the key itself belongs is part of the moral work that follows. Understanding history requires not just brilliance in translation, but also humility, dialogue, a deep consideration of justice. The stone taught us how to read Egypt. Now it asks us to think carefully about how we honor it. The stone was a success, but it also reminds us of what we haven't heard. It's a solved mystery, surrounded by stones that are still silent. There are ancient scripts all over the world that are still locked. The logic that unlocked Egypt hasn't found its match for every lost language. These are the unfinished scripts, the mysteries that remain. Take the clay tablets from Manon, Crete. The script is called Linear-A. It's over 3,500 years old from the palace culture at Knossos. We have hundreds of these tablets, mostly inventories of goods. We can see the numbers. We can guess some words from patterns, but the language itself is a ghost. Without a bilingual key, without a stone for the Aegean, the sounds and meanings slip away. Was it an early form of Greek, or a language with no living relatives? Every time we try to use the phonetic principles that worked for hieroglyphs, we hit a wall, unknown symbols, an unknown tongue. Then far to the east, there's the Indus Valley Civilization, a vast urban culture over 4,000 years ago in what's now Pakistan and northwest India. They left thousands of small, carved seals, often with a beautiful stylized animal and a short line of symbols above it. The script is elegant, seems to be logosyllabic with hundreds of distinct signs, but the texts are incredibly short. The longest inscription is only 26 signs. There's no lengthy text, no royal decree. No epic poem to analyze for patterns. And again, no bilingual monument has ever been found. The language family is debated. The brevity means statistical analysis can only go so far. It's a whisper of a script, too faint for even our most powerful computers to amplify. On the other side of the globe, on Easter Island, there's the script called, carved on wooden tablets in a unique style. The lines alternate direction like an ox plowing a field. Only about 24 genuine artifacts survive. The island's tragic history in the 19th century severed the living connection. The last people who might have known how to read it were gone before scholars could record it. Now the glyphs of birds and fish and strange geometric figures just stare back. Their ritual or genealogical messages are completely opaque. It's a script born in isolation, and it seems destined to remain in a kind of intellectual isolation, a closed book. The attempts to crack these codes are direct descendants of that 19th century race. Modern use vast computational power. They run statistical analyses on symbol frequency and positioning, looking for the grammatical skeleton had to intuit. They use pattern recognition algorithms to group signs. They compare the scripts to every known language family. Yet without that critical external key, a parallel text in a known language, the work is like trying to solve a jigsaw puzzle without the picture on the box. You can see how the pieces might fit, but you can't be sure what you're building. That's the enduring legacy of the stone. It wasn't an end, but a definitive beginning, a proof of concept for all of human history. It showed that with the right key, with obsessive dedication, and with a flash of genius, the silent voices of the past can be made to speak again. Every undeciphered script is now a challenge, an invitation to the next generation who might one day hold a new key or develop a new method to listen where we currently hear only silence. The race didn't finish in 1822. It just expanded its track to every corner of the ancient world. Our conversation with history is never fully complete. The connection happens in quiet moments, not in temples. It's personal. The language opens more than official records. It opens private letters, personal thoughts. There's a man named a scribe, around 1100 before the Common Era. He wasn't a pharaoh. He was a father, worried about his son's character. He wrote a long text of advice. The instructions of and the voice in it is gentle, practical. He warns against greed, says a hot-tempered man is like a tree in a courtyard. Sooner or later it ends up on the woodpile. He advises humility, honesty, a quiet heart. This isn't a decree, it's a parent's hope, a manual for living. Observations about human nature that feel just as relevant now. 3,000 years later, the distance between his world and ours just disappears. Then there's a letter, found in a tomb, from a man to his wife who had died. He writes it on a bowl, a piece of pottery, so she might get it in the next world. His grief is raw, confused. He asks her what he did wrong, says, "I did not do anything you would blame. Why won't you speak to me? I can't see in this darkness." This isn't formal ritual. This is the sound of loneliness. Someone trying to reach across the final barrier. A universal cry, preserved in the dry Egyptian air. When we read it, we're not studying a burial custom. We're listening to heartbreak. And we meet ambition, professional pride, an architect, a royal steward named, he served under the Pharaoh I. On his tomb wall he had his biography carved. He lists his projects, his honors, but then he adds something about the Pharaoh's secret tomb in the Valley of the Kings. He says, "I alone supervised the excavation. No one saw, no one heard, the boast is clear." He was trusted with the ultimate secret. His pride wasn't just in the building, it was in the discretion. The unique confidence placed in him. It's like a craftsman signing his masterpiece in a hidden place, a personal footnote to history. These fragments, the father's advice, the husband's plea, the architect's quiet boast, they do something. They collapse they strip away the exoticism, the animal-headed gods, the golden mask. What's left is familiar. The desire to guide a child, the anguish of missing someone, the satisfaction of a job well done, and recognize the ancient Egyptians stopped being a mysterious other. A civilization of inscrutable monuments. They become individual, people who laughed at jokes we might not get, who worried about harvests, about health, who loved their families, wanted a legacy. That's the real triumph of the decipherment. The stone did more than unlock the language of gods and kings. It gave us the grammar of the human heart across 3,000 years. It proved that while sand buries empires, while styles change, the core emotions that define a life, ambition, love, loss, pride, they are constants. The stone's greatest gift isn't the history it clarified, it's the humanity it restored. The race to decode the stone was more than a contest of minds. It was humanity recovering a lost chapter of its own story. For 1,000 years, ancient Egypt was this silent theater. We could see the stage, the pyramids, the statues, the gold, but we couldn't hear the lines. The actors were mute. The plot was just a guess. And breakthrough wasn't just a translation. It raised the curtain. It turned on the lights, and a 3,000-year performance just resumed. We heard pharaohs declare laws. We listened to priests chant hymns. We overheard farmers arguing over the price of a donkey. A whole civilization, frozen in stone, began to breathe again. This was the recovery of memory on a scale we'd never seen. It proved a culture isn't truly gone as long as its words can be understood. The silence wasn't permanent. It was a pause, waiting for the right key to turn. And that key was forged from obsession and intellectual courage. Sleep wasn't a lucky guess. It was the end of a life spent in preparation, building a bridge between a dead language and its living echo in Coptic. He had the audacity to challenge centuries of belief, to see an alphabet where everyone else saw sacred symbols. His perseverance and the competitive fire of his rivalry with Thomas Young created the pressure that finally cracked the code. Their story shows that the most formidable secrets yield not to force, but to a stubborn, curious mind, a mind willing to question every assumption. The stone itself was a monument to bureaucratic efficiency, a practical decree about tax exemptions, and yet it became the vessel for one of history's greatest intellectual adventures. It reminds us that profound truth is often hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to look at the familiar in a new way. Today, the work of resurrection continues. With tools couldn't have dreamed of, modern Egyptologists aren't just translators. They're digital archivists using spectral imaging to read papyri burned to charcoal. They're medical detectives using CT scans to read amulets sealed inside mummies for. They're data scientists searching vast corpora of texts for patterns no single scholar could ever trace. This ongoing dialogue deepens our connection. Each new inscription, each analyzed potsherd, adds another sentence to the conversation. We're no longer just decoding a static past. We're engaging with a dynamic history, one that continues to surprise us. The language of the Pharaohs was the ultimate time machine, and now it's also a lens. It focuses our understanding of art, of politics, of science, of the very human struggles for meaning and order. So what began with a soldier noticing a dark slab in a wall became a gateway. It opened a world where gods have names, where kings have voices, where ordinary people from a distant age can share their fears and their hopes with us. The stone's true legacy is the proof it offers. It proves that no wall of time is truly impermeable. That with curiosity, with perseverance, and with a willingness to listen, we can recover lost worlds. And in doing that, we better understand the long, unbroken story we're all a part of.